The weight of my son's wallet slammed into my chest, his voice echoing, "You're just a monthly expense." Still, I stood there, my hand gripping the cold leather as the shock settled in. As his betrayal hung in the air, the sting of his words burned deeper than I'd ever imagined. While the reality of our relationship hit me, I realized this had to end. The same hands that had always supported him would no longer give. That's when I decided. I was done. No more. It was over. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The February chill nipped at Diane's face as she climbed the steps to Caleb's front door. The weight of the grocery bags shifted against her arms, a reminder of the small things that had become second nature over the years. She pressed the doorbell, listening to its cheerful chime echo inside before the door creaked open. Brittany appeared in the doorway, her smile a practiced thing, thin and polite. "Hey, Diane," she greeted, but there was something off about her tone. Something distant. "Hey, sweetheart," Diane replied, stepping inside. The smell of something burnt lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of baby powder. "Thanks for bringing these," Brittany said, eyeing the bags. "But you know, I would have preferred if you'd gotten the other brand. The kids don't like this one. You know how they are." Diane blinked, taken aback for a moment. Of course, Brittany had never been shy about pointing out these small things. The brand, the color, the size. It was always something, but Diane nodded and started unloading the bags anyway. "I'm sure they'll get used to it." Before Brittany could say anything else, Caleb's voice rang out from the kitchen. "Mom!" he barked. The irritation in his tone was unmistakable. Diane glanced at Brittany, who barely shrugged before making her way to the couch. The tension in the air was palpable, but Diane was used to it. Caleb's mood swings had become a constant in her life. She made her way to the kitchen, setting the bags down on the counter. Caleb stood there, his face pinched with frustration as he looked at a stack of unopened bills, papers strewn across the table. He didn't bother to acknowledge her presence, just continued muttering under his breath as he rifled through the pile. Diane glanced at the bills and then at Caleb. "What's going on?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice neutral. He slammed a bill onto the counter, his face flushed with anger. This damn utility bill," he spat, pushing it toward her. "I don't know how you expect me to keep up with this stuff when you don't even help me plan ahead." Diane stayed silent for a moment, watching him, the knot in her stomach tightening. She had been helping for years, always paying a little more here, covering a little more there. But Caleb never seemed to appreciate it. Instead, it was always a new emergency, a new problem to fix. She took a deep breath, her voice calm, though she could feel the edge creeping up. "I've helped pay it before, Caleb, and you said you'd take care of it. I don't mind helping, but you have to stay on top of these things too." His eyes snapped up to meet hers, and for a moment, Diane felt the anger radiating from him, hot and sharp. His jaw clenched, the words coming out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them in for far too long. "I don't need you to play savior anymore," he shouted. "You think I'm some damn child, don't you? I don't need you to hold my hand every time something goes wrong." Diane's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. "I'm just trying to help, Caleb. That's what family does." But before she could say anything more, he exploded, his words laced with venom. "You're just a monthly expense." In one swift motion, he grabbed his wallet from the counter and flung it at her, the leather snapping open mid-air before it landed with a soft thud on her chest. Diane stood frozen for a second, the wallet still pressed against her, her breath caught in her throat. The insult was like a slap, but it didn't sting like she expected. It was worse. It cut deep in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Behind her, Diane heard Mason's voice, barely a whisper but filled with horror. "Grandma!" She turned, her eyes meeting his, and saw the confusion and pain written all over his face. He had witnessed it all. He had watched his father's outburst, seen the way his words hit Diane like a bullet. Her heart twisted. She didn't want him to see this, didn't want him to know that the family she'd spent so many years trying to hold together had begun to crack wide open. But there was no turning back now. Diane's hand closed around the wallet. It felt heavy in her palm, but not because of the money inside. It felt heavy with the weight of the years of quietly shouldering the burden, of never being seen as anything more than a financial lifeline. Years of being the bank, the fallback, the emergency fund. And suddenly, it was as if something inside her snapped into place. She looked at Caleb, her son, the man who had made her feel small, unappreciated, and used. The words he had thrown at her reverberated in her mind. "You're just a monthly expense." That was it. That was all she was to him. She didn't owe him anything anymore. With a quiet resolve, Diane turned on her heel. "I think I'll be going now," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Mason moved to follow her, but she stopped him with a soft look. "Stay here, Mason. I'll be fine." As she walked toward the door, she felt the weight of the wallet still in her hand. She would make sure Caleb understood just how costly his words had been. She stepped out into the cold night, the chill biting at her skin, but inside, something inside her was starting to thaw. She was done being his safety net, done being his lifeline. She had just been handed the ultimate verdict, and she wasn't going to ignore it. The door shut softly behind her, and the crunch of her boots on the frozen ground was the only sound that remained. The car hummed beneath Diane's hands as she gripped the steering wheel, her fingers stiff from holding on too tightly. The winter road stretched out before her, a gray ribbon that seemed to disappear into the horizon. The cold air still clung to her skin, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the road, but her mind replayed the moment over and over, the wallet hitting her, Caleb's words echoing in her ears. "You're just a monthly expense." The phrase had landed like a hammer blow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it had cracked something deep inside her, something she hadn't even realized was fragile. But there was no fear now, no panic, just a strange clarity that settled over her, like the fog lifting. For years, she had been the one to soften every blow Caleb threw her way. She had made excuses for him, allowed his demands to consume her. And now it was over. Her grip loosened on the wheel slightly, the tension in her body starting to ease as the reality of the situation took root. It wasn't fear that made her fingers tremble. It was the weight of the decision she had made and the raw certainty that came with it. The headlights of a passing car briefly lit up the interior of the car, casting strange shadows across her face, but Diane's gaze remained steady. The soft glow of the streetlights as she drove through the quiet, suburban streets of Westerville felt like a distant, unimportant world. Everything else seemed so small compared to what had just happened. As she neared her house, she saw the porch light flicker, casting a pale yellow light against the snow-dusted ground. Diane's heart gave a little tug. Glenn. She hadn't called him yet, but she knew he would be awake. He always kept an eye out for her, always made sure she was okay. She parked the car, shutting off the engine. The cold air rushed in as she opened the door, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Glenn was already standing at the end of his driveway, his frame outlined against the darkened house. He had been waiting. "Diane?" he called out softly, his voice carrying through the still night. Diane didn't answer right away. She just walked toward him, the weight of everything pressing down on her. As she got closer, she saw the concern etched on his face. Glenn had always been her neighbor, her friend. He was someone she trusted, someone who had always been a steady presence when her world felt off balance. "I'm okay, Glenn," she said quietly. but there was a hardness to her voice that hadn't been there before. He studied her face, as if trying to gauge the depth of whatever had shaken her. What happened? Diane stopped in front of him, looking up at the sky for a moment before turning her eyes back to him. She didn't need to dramatize the situation. There was no need for theatrics. The truth of what had just occurred was clear in every line of her face. "I'm done, Glenn," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I can't do it anymore." He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Diane knew Glenn had always respected her quiet strength, but he also knew her better than most. He could sense when something fundamental had shifted in her. "Then stop paying," Glenn finally said, his words quiet but direct. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a challenge, an invitation to stop being the savior she had spent her life trying to be. Diane didn't answer right away, but the simplicity of Glenn's statement hit her harder than anything else. She had been paying for years, paying her son's bills, paying for his mistakes, paying for his failures. She turned away from him and walked up the steps to her porch. The door was unlocked, and she let herself inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a blanket. But it wasn't the warmth she needed now. It wasn't a comforting kind of warmth. It was the space to think. She moved quickly to the desk in the corner of the living room, pulling open the drawer where she kept her binder. It was thick with years of receipts, bank statements, and records of every transfer she had made. She didn't have to look long. She knew exactly where to find it. The binder felt heavy in her hands as she laid it out on the desk. She flipped through the pages, each one a record of how much she had given, how much she had sacrificed. Caleb's name appeared on so many of the transfers: mortgage payments, car insurance, groceries when they forgot payday, the money that had kept him comfortable when he couldn't be bothered to take care of his own life. Her finger hovered over a recent request, one she had made for Caleb. A final request, just like the others, but somehow it felt different. Something about it didn't sit right anymore. Maybe it was the fact that she had already given so much, or maybe it was the final insult that had driven the nail into the coffin. She pulled out a pen and circled the request, then she drew a line through it. Her hand didn't tremble as she did it. There was no hesitation. Caleb had crossed a line, and now she would be the one to draw the boundary. She wouldn't be his safety net anymore. Her mind was made up, and the clarity that had settled over her in the car had only deepened here, in the quiet of her home. This was the point of no return. She shut the binder with a soft thud, her heart thumping, but steady now. The weight of the decision was no longer something to fear. It was something she had chosen. She stood up, her thoughts racing with the next steps. Diane wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had just taken control of her life, and there was no going back. The office smelled like polished wood and paper, clean, orderly, and calm. Abigail's desk was meticulous, as always. Every file, every document, placed precisely where it needed to be. Diane stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that matched her thoughts. She had made the decision to come here, and now the process would begin. Abigail looked up as she entered, her sharp eyes taking in the quiet determination in Diane's face. "You look like you've made up your mind," she said, pushing a few papers aside to make room for her. Diane didn't reply right away. She just nodded, a steady motion that seemed to resonate with the finality in her chest. She had been walking through the motions for so long, always hoping Caleb would change, always willing to forgive the next mistake. But today, when his words had landed like an accusation, the truth had become undeniable. He didn't care. He never had. Abigail gestured for Diane to sit, and Diane lowered herself into the chair, her hands steady in her lap. She didn't need to say much. She knew Abigail could read her expression well enough. Abigail opened the binder Diane had brought, flipping through pages of receipts, bank statements, and transfer logs. She was a professional, a no-nonsense woman who had seen countless families torn apart by money, but this was different. Diane's file was thicker than most. It was a record of years, of sacrifices, of being used. The more Abigail read, the more her brows furrowed. "Diane, you've funded their life for years," she said, her voice laced with astonishment. "Mortgage top-offs, car insurance, utility bills, groceries, when they forgot payday. The list is endless." Diane didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She had kept track of it all. Every transaction, every time Caleb had reached out, every time she had covered for him. It was more than just money. It was the emotional toll that she had never documented but had always felt. She had carried it all for him, without complaint, until now. Abigail shook her head slightly as she sifted through the pages. "How did you let it go on this long?" she asked, not as a judgment, but as a simple inquiry. Diane's hands tightened briefly around the armrests of the chair, her nails digging into the leather. "I kept thinking he'd get it together. I kept hoping it would be the last time." The words hung in the air between them, a quiet acknowledgement of a pattern that had continued for too long. But Diane wasn't here to rehash the past. She was here to fix things, to finally make Caleb understand the cost of his actions. Abigail flipped a few more pages before glancing up at Diane. "We'll need to file for revocation and redirect the trust," she said with a steady authority. "All joint permissions must be withdrawn, and any access he has to your financial resources will be cut off." Diane nodded again, her resolve hardening. "Do whatever needs to be done." Abigail pulled out a legal pad and began jotting down notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. "We'll get the paperwork in order. Trust documents will be restructured, accounts frozen, and we'll put fraud prevention flags on your most vulnerable assets." She paused, meeting Diane's eyes with a focused intensity. "This will make things very clear for him. He won't be able to wiggle out of it. There will be no second chances." Diane sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about stopping the financial support. This was about making Caleb face the consequences, about forcing him to take responsibility, not just for his actions, but for his life. "I don't think he'll understand at first," Diane said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with something else, a mixture of weariness and determination. "But he'll learn. I've done enough. I'm done being his crutch." Abigail leaned back, her hands steepled in front of her as she observed Diane. "And you're sure about this? This is going to change everything for him." Diane's gaze didn't waver. "It's already changed. This is just the next step." Abigail's lips twitched slightly like she was approving of what she saw. "All right then, we'll move forward." She pushed a thick stack of papers toward Diane. "This will be the legal groundwork. I'll handle the finer details, but you'll need to sign everything." Diane's fingers brushed against the papers, but she didn't pick them up just yet. Something about the moment felt significant, almost too final. She had been here before, had made decisions she thought were irreversible, only to backtrack when things got hard. But this time was different. This time, she knew she wasn't turning back. "I'm ready," Diane said, and her voice held the weight of 1,000 unspoken decisions. Abigail didn't respond right away, but the look in her eyes said everything. She had seen this before, but never quite like this. The quiet strength that had always defined Diane was sharper now, a sharpness that would carve out the space she needed to take control. As Diane signed the first document, her hand steady as if this was the easiest thing she had ever done, a sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't the peace of someone who had solved all their problems. It was the peace of someone who had finally taken ownership of their own life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Diane could almost feel the weight of it, silent, relentless. But beneath that quiet, there was the promise of something new. She signed her name again, the ink flowing with a smooth, deliberate motion. This was it. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, its sound cutting through the stillness of the house. Diane had left it there earlier, forgotten in the wake of the paperwork. The decision, the finality of it all. She hadn't even looked at it. But now, standing in the quiet of her kitchen, the phone demanded her attention. A text message. Caleb's name flashed on the screen, a stark reminder of everything that had led to this moment. She didn't reach for it. Instead, Diane turned away, walking toward the desk in the corner. The binder sat there, thick and heavy with years of receipts, transfer records, and proof of every financial obligation she had ever shouldered. The time had come to face it all, to sift through the chaos of her own giving, to see exactly what had been sacrificed for the son who had taken her for granted. As her hands moved over the pages, her mind flickered back to the years that had blurred together. The endless payments, the promises she'd believed in, the lies she had allowed herself to swallow. Each receipt told a story. Each transfer marked a moment of hope, a fleeting belief that Caleb might change, that this time would be different. But as her fingers paused on the latest transfer, the message blinked again. This time a reminder of the message she had ignored. Caleb's words. "Mom, I need your help. Please. You can't leave me like this." The phone buzzed again. She exhaled, but her eyes didn't waver from the receipts she was sorting. She couldn't respond. She wouldn't. Her finger hovered over the page, the numbers blurring for a moment. This was the moment of clarity, the moment where she could see the truth in black and white. There was no more bending, no more excuses. Caleb had crossed a line, and the cost was too high. Mason's voice broke into her thoughts, soft, distant, like a whisper in the wind. The phone vibrated again. It was a message from him. "Grandma, I'm sorry." Diane's heart clenched. She looked at the text for a long moment, her throat tightening. Mason didn't deserve this. He hadn't asked for any of it. But he was the one who had been forced to witness his father's cruelty. He had been watching this unfold, helpless, just like she had for so long. She tapped her fingers against the edge of the desk, her thoughts tangled in a mix of love and sorrow. She would not break now, not for Caleb, not for anyone. Her fingers moved slowly over the keys, typing out a reply. "Mason, it's not your fault. I'm proud of you. Please don't worry about me." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, a small moment of reassurance for him, even if it didn't ease the storm swirling inside her. The phone buzzed again, but this time it was Glenn, his name lighting up the screen. Diane looked at the text, reading it before responding. "I'm coming over. We need to get this started. Everything's in motion." Diane stared at the message for a moment, letting the words sink in. Glenn had been a steady presence, the one person who had kept her grounded through all of this. They weren't just neighbors anymore. He was someone she could rely on, someone who understood the magnitude of the change she was making. He wouldn't judge her. He knew what needed to be done. She turned toward the printer, pulling out the next stack of documents she needed. There was no more waiting, no more hesitation. Caleb's fate had been sealed. And now, it was time to finish the job. By the time Glenn arrived, the house had transformed into a battlefield of sorts. Papers scattered across the table, ink pens and highlighters scattered in every corner. Diane was sitting at the desk, organizing the bank summaries, the withdrawal logs, the trust documents that would sever the final ties to her son. Glenn walked in without knocking, as he always did, his steps heavy with purpose. He didn't need to say anything. He simply moved to the printer and began to help, his hands steady as he prepared the final versions of the documents. Once these are printed and signed, it's done, Glenn said, his voice low, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a cloud. Diane didn't answer right away. She let the silence settle between them, knowing that everything was about to change. It wasn't just about cutting off Caleb's access to her accounts. It was about taking back control, reclaiming her life. She turned the page and saw the final line, signature of beneficiary, Caleb Mercer. Her pen hovered over the line. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world paused. It wasn't just a signature. It was the end of everything she had ever been for him. With a steady hand, Diane signed her name. The ink slid across the page with finality. Glenn took the document from her and began preparing the next one. Diane's eyes flickered over the rest of the paperwork, her mind already focused on the next step. It was happening. The wheels were turning. Abigail's drafting the initial separation packet now, Glenn said, his voice steady. But there was an undercurrent of something else, something uncertain. This was a moment of no return for both of them. Diane was finally drawing the line. Caleb would never see this coming. The doorbell rang and Glenn looked up, but Diane didn't move. She knew who it was. The next step would be to lock everything in place. The final piece of the puzzle would be put into motion. Diane took a deep breath, letting the calm of the moment fill her. She was no longer the woman who had bent and bent for Caleb. She had become the woman who would finally make him face the consequences of his choices. And now, it was time. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around Diane as she sat at the desk. The document spread out before her like a testament to the life she had built, and now, irrevocably, torn apart. Glenn stood behind her, his presence quiet but solid, like a rock against the storm Diane had been bracing for. The papers in front of her had once been a collection of promises, a roadmap of the years she'd spent giving and forgiving. Now, each page was a marker of what she was leaving behind, what she was cutting away for good. Diane's pen hovered over the first document, revocation of access to financial accounts. She could feel the weight of it in her hand, the gravity of the decision thick in the air. Caleb had relied on her for so long, but now it was time for him to learn what it meant to face the world without her crutch. "You're sure about this?" Glenn asked, his voice low, careful. It wasn't doubt in his tone, but something else. A quiet respect for the finality of this moment. Diane didn't look up from the papers. Instead, she nodded. Her mind was clear, her thoughts sharpened by the weeks of tension, the years of resentment that had built up like layers of sediment. She had given enough. And now, the accounts that had held Caleb's world together, auto-pay links, credit card benefits, the constant stream of funds she had handed over, would be severed. With one swift motion, she signed the first line. The ink bled onto the page with the weight of an ending. The sound of the pen on paper felt almost too loud in the quiet room. A final act. No turning back. Glenn picked up the signed document, then set it aside, reaching for the next. Diane's eyes traced the remaining papers. Account removals. Financial redirection. Trust restructuring. She would strip him of everything, everything she had given him. Her fingers moved to the next form. Auto-pay link removal. She signed it without hesitation, marking the end of Caleb's easy access to her bank accounts. He had taken her money for granted, using it as if it were his right. She couldn't even count how many times she had paid his bills, fixed his mistakes, paid for his failures. No more. Each signature was a weight lifted from her shoulders. Done, Diane murmured to herself. She moved on to the next form, the trust document for Mason. This one was different. This wasn't just about cutting Caleb off. This was for Mason. Diane's heart tightened slightly as she thought of him, the boy who had seen too much, who had grown up under the shadow of his father's failures. She would make sure that Mason would never have to face the same uncertainty that Caleb had put her through. She established a small trust for Mason, one that Caleb would never touch, one that would protect him from any future interference from his parents, the small, quiet act of love for the grandson she had tried to shield from the chaos. Diane signed the document, her hand steady, her heart steady. The love she had for Mason was unwavering. He deserved a chance. She turned the page to the next document. Fraud prevention flags. She glanced up at Glenn, meeting his eyes for the first time since they'd started. There was a certain weight in his gaze, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just about paperwork. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her life, her peace. He nodded, his hands moving to gather the necessary stamps and certifications. "Abigail's handling the final filings," he said, his voice steady. "We're almost there." Diane's fingers trembled slightly as she finished the last section. This was the moment of no return. With a final stroke, she closed the binder, the document sealed with the weight of her decisions. She'd done everything she could. One last form sat before her, closing the helper account. It had been a lifeline for Caleb, an unspoken agreement that Diane would always be there to fix things, to bail him out. That account had been a symbol of everything she had sacrificed, a constant reminder of how far she had bent for him. The account would be closed. Glenn placed a stack of notarized documents beside her, his gaze lingering on the final paper. "When this is done, it's over. No going back." Diane closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the past few hours settling in. She had made a decision. And now it was time to close the door. With a deep breath, she signed the final document, the last piece of the puzzle. Her pen hovered over the signature line for a moment longer than necessary. This wasn't just a financial decision. This was the severing of a tie that had bound her to Caleb for so many years. It was the end of her role as the constant fixer, the constant enabler. She pressed the pen down with deliberate force. Done. The finality of it was absolute. Glenn collected the documents, standing up with a soft sigh as he walked toward the printer to make the final copies. Diane sat back in her chair, staring at the closed binder in front of her. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the printer, the faint click of the buttons, the settling of the weight that now filled the space between them. For the first time in years, Diane felt light, as though a burden had been lifted. But she couldn't deny the undercurrent of sadness that tugged at her heart. She wasn't heartless. This wasn't easy. It had never been easy. But it was necessary. And in the end, that was enough. Her phone buzzed again. Diane glanced at it, but this time she didn't flinch. She didn't reach for it. She was done. Now, the next steps were beyond her control. The consequences were Caleb's to face. She took a deep breath and turned her gaze to the window. The snow was falling softly outside, a quiet blanket over the world. The stillness of it was somehow comforting. It was done. It was over. And now, the world waited. The phone buzzed again, the sharp vibration against the quiet of the house breaking the stillness. Diane's hand twitched. But she didn't reach for it. She had felt it coming. The surge of panic on the other end, the pleading, the anger, all of it. Caleb's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, Diane wondered if she should pick it up. But then she thought about everything she'd just signed, everything she had done to put the final nail in this chapter of her life. She didn't pick up. Instead, she let it ring. Her gaze focused on the snow falling softly outside her window. The coldness of the winter mirrored the coldness she felt inside. The silence after the call ended was just as thick as the quiet before. Without a word, she swiped the screen to send the call to voicemail. Caleb would have to hear it in his own time. She wasn't going to do it for him anymore. "I'll get it later," she muttered to herself, leaning back in her chair. The weight of the day, of the decisions, still pressed down on her chest, but there was a small spark of something she hadn't expected. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from taking control of your life, no longer being at the mercy of someone else's chaos. Across the room, Glenn was already moving toward the desk, his fingers tapping lightly against his phone. Diane had already given him the go-ahead, the final seal on everything, but Glenn was meticulous. He wasn't about to let Caleb, or anyone, try to worm their way back in. "Abigail's drafting the cease contact notice," he said, his voice calm but firm as he slid his phone into his pocket. He glanced at Diane, his eyes meeting hers with a reassuring look. "It'll be official. You won't have to deal with any more requests. No more messages. No more emergencies. It's done." Diane nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had expected things like this. The calls, the messages, the manipulation. Caleb didn't know how to do anything but take. He had no sense of the cost. And now, he would learn. "Good," Diane said quietly, the word almost foreign on her lips. There was no anger left in her, not anymore. She had moved past that. It was a relief, really. But a small part of her still felt the sharp sting of betrayal. The years she had spent trying to salvage something that was never hers to fix. Glenn moved to the other side of the room, where Diane had left her laptop on the coffee table. He started typing quickly, fingers flying across the keys as he helped Diane update her digital passwords. Everything from bank accounts to email addresses, all of it locked tight. Diane watched as the screen blinked in front of her, each keystroke another layer of security. Another wall built between her and the son who had taken too much. The printer hummed to life again, and she glanced at Glenn, who handed her the new documents. "It's all updated. No more access. He won't get another penny, not even a chance to try." Diane didn't speak. She simply took the papers from him, her mind already somewhere else, focused on the quiet peace of the moment. The world outside was blanketed in snow, silent and still, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the same way. It was done. It was all behind her now. But then a faint buzzing broke the silence again. Diane's phone lit up once more, but this time it was a message from Mason. "Grandma, they're scrambling." Diane's chest tightened at the words, the simple message speaking volumes. She didn't have to ask who they were. Caleb and Brittany, of course, still trying to claw their way back into her life. It wouldn't take long before they realized they had nothing left. No more safety nets. No more bailouts. Glenn looked up from his phone when he heard the sound of Diane's phone buzzing. "Mason?" he asked quietly. Diane nodded, her thumb hovering over the screen. She wasn't sure what to feel. Pride, relief, or something else entirely. Her hand shook slightly as she typed back a reply. "It's over, Mason. Don't worry, you're safe." She hit send, the words feeling too simple for what they meant. She had made sure of it. Caleb could scramble all he wanted, but the game had changed, and he wasn't prepared for it. "I should get this sent out, just to make sure they can't find a way around it," Glenn said, walking toward the door with the stack of papers. Diane watched him go, her heart still thumping quietly in her chest. As the door closed behind him, Diane sat alone in the room, the silence now absolute. The weight of the day had finally started to settle into her bones. But there was no regret, only clarity. The next few hours would bring their own challenges. She had no illusions about that. Caleb would lash out, try to manipulate, try to guilt her back into submission. But Diane was done. She had drawn the line, and no one, not Caleb, not Brittany, was going to cross it again. The phone buzzed once more. Diane glanced down at it, but this time she didn't reach for it. Let it go to voicemail. Let Caleb and Brittany try to figure out what came next. She had already decided. For the first time, Diane felt something that had eluded her for so long: control, and it felt like freedom. Diane's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Caleb's name was on the message that had lit up her phone again, but this time there was no urgency to her response, no rush to know what it was he wanted to say. She simply read the words, her lips tight with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Mom, you can't do this. I'm your son. I need you." The words echoed in her mind for a brief moment, but they didn't make her falter. They didn't pierce through the wall she had built up over the past few days. In fact, they barely made her feel anything at all. She pressed the delete button without even thinking. Caleb had said it all before, countless times. He had asked, pleaded, demanded, and manipulated. Each time she had fallen into the same trap, convinced that he might change, that he might see the effort she'd put in, the sacrifices she'd made. But now, the trap was gone. There was no going back. The message disappeared into oblivion as though it had never existed. And with it, Caleb's attempts to reach her, his endless attempts to drag her back into his world of need, vanished. Diane set the phone down on the table beside her. She was done with it. Done with the constant tether it had been for so long. Caleb's voice had been a constant presence in her life, but now it was gone, fading into the distance where it belonged. The silence was almost sacred now. She stood, moving towards the window as the faint light of dusk filled the room. Outside, the snow had intensified, soft flakes falling steadily from a sky filled with nothing but gray. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, untouched by the turmoil that had defined so much of her life. Her mind wandered as she watched the snow accumulate, layer by layer. In a way, it felt like the way things were now. Calm, quiet, settled. The chaos had settled too, and the weight of everything, of all the years of giving and forgiving, of trying to make something work that never could, had finally lifted. Glenn appeared at the door, breaking the stillness, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was all she needed right now. He moved into the room, his hands full with a stack of paperwork that would complete what they'd started. He set it down on the table in front of her, careful as always, but there was a slight weariness in his eyes. The same kind of weariness she felt in her own bones. "I've updated the fraud alerts with your bank," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something else, perhaps relief. He knew the weight she had carried, and now, with every step of action, every form completed, the chains that had bound her to Caleb were broken. Diane nodded, but her mind wasn't focused on the bank, or even the fraud alerts. It was on the next step, making sure that Caleb would never have the chance to manipulate her again. Without a word, she turned her attention to the next form: beneficiary designations. She had already signed so many documents today, but this one felt like the final severing of any remaining connection. Caleb had always assumed he would inherit everything. He had always assumed that, no matter how reckless or irresponsible he became, Diane would always be there to pick up the pieces. She didn't even hesitate as she removed his name from the beneficiary list. The lines had already been drawn, but this was the one that sealed it. Caleb would no longer benefit from her hard work, from the years of sacrifice. There was no reason for him to profit off of her once she was gone. Diane signed the form with a quiet, resolute finality. The act was swift, simple, and unremarkable. But in its simplicity, it felt like the last step in cutting him off entirely. Turning to the next task, she picked up the letter she had started earlier. The one for Mason. It wasn't just a letter. It was a promise. She had made sure that Mason's future would be secure, no matter what. He wouldn't have to live with the burden Caleb had placed on her. She would make sure of it. As she began to write, her handwriting steady, the words came easily. "Mason, I've made sure you will be taken care of no matter what. This trust is for your future, one that will be free of the mistakes your father and I made. You are my greatest gift, and I want you to grow up knowing that no matter the circumstances, you are loved and you are secure. Always. The words felt right. They felt like everything she had hoped for Mason, everything he deserved. Diane set the letter aside and picked up the trust documentation that would accompany it, the final piece to his future security. As she finished the documents and closed the folder, Abigail's name came to mind. She had been instrumental in making all of this happen. Her sharp mind and legal expertise had paved the way for Diane to take back control of her life. Diane had trusted her, and now, Abigail was filing the updated estate structures. The process had moved swiftly, and now everything was in place. Caleb had nothing left to take from her. Diane had ensured that Mason would never be caught in the crossfire again. She moved back to the window, letting her fingers rest lightly on the cool glass as she gazed out. The snow still fell, gentle and undisturbed. There was no rushing it, no way to stop it. And for the first time in years, Diane felt like she too was at peace with the passage of time. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't even flinch. She didn't need to check it. Whatever Caleb or Brittany had to say didn't matter anymore. She had already decided. And now, as the world outside settled into silence, Diane allowed herself to truly breathe. The silence was her victory. The email came in at precisely 10:47 a.m. Diane had been standing at the window, watching the snow pile up in the yard, when the familiar ping of her phone broke the silence. She had half expected it, but the sight of Caleb's lawyer's name still sent a jolt through her. The words on the screen, however, didn't have the same impact they might have a week ago. She clicked on it. The message was direct, almost professional in its tone. Caleb's lawyer claimed she had abandoned financial commitments and demanded that she restore Caleb's access to his previous financial support, citing family obligations and her moral duty. Diane set the phone down slowly, her breath calm despite the sharpness of the accusation. It was almost laughable. She had spent years supporting Caleb, more than her fair share, and now, this. The audacity. The idea that her moral duty was to be his ATM, that her responsibility to her son was to be an endless well, with no expectation of return. She wasn't sure whether to feel anger, pity, or amusement, but she did feel one thing clearly: clarity. Caleb had pushed it too far this time. Abigail's response came swiftly, a legal email written with precision and coldness. Diane had seen Abigail in action before, sharp, no nonsense. As she read through the email, the satisfaction of knowing that Abigail was on her side, and that they had the evidence to back up everything, settled into Diane's bones. All transfers were voluntary, with no contractual obligations to provide ongoing support. Abigail's message said, "We are happy to provide transaction logs and records to demonstrate that all financial assistance was given as a gift, and there is no legal requirement for Diane Mercer to continue these payments." Abigail didn't just answer the lawyer's claims, she crushed them. She had done her homework. Every transfer, every time Diane had bailed Caleb out, was voluntary. There was no contract, no legal obligation. Just years of a son manipulating his mother's goodwill. Diane sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. There was no turning back now. They could try all they wanted, but Caleb and his lawyer had miscalculated. He had taken her kindness for weakness, but now the truth was plain to see. She wasn't afraid anymore. Glenn walked in just as Diane was about to forward the email to her own account for safekeeping. He'd been quiet for the past few hours, his energy spent after helping with the paperwork, but Diane knew the wheels were still turning in his mind. He was meticulous, always anticipating the next move. "Another message from Brittany?" he asked without looking up from his phone. Diane just nodded, but the corners of her mouth lifted in a faint, ironic smile. She hadn't expected anything different. Brittany had already posted on social media, passive-aggressively lamenting how stingy parents had ruined Christmas for their son. Diane wasn't surprised. Brittany had always been good at using her image to manipulate, to paint herself as the victim. But the words weren't cutting anymore. "I'll save a screenshot," Glenn said, already pulling up the post. It was just as expected. A thinly veiled jab, this time wrapped in a post about how some people don't understand how hard it is to make ends meet with no help. A complaint about how Diane had always been the one to help out. But now that the well is dry, some people are left out in the cold. Diane couldn't help but shake her head. There it was. The same old script. The martyrdom, the manipulation, the twisted version of reality where Caleb and Brittany played the victim while she had been the one giving, the one losing, the one bending. Glenn held up his phone, showing her the screenshot. Diane didn't respond immediately. She just sat there for a moment, watching the image of Brittany's carefully crafted self-pity. It had lost its power over her now. She was done. "Send it to Abigail," Diane said finally, the words smooth, unwavering. Glenn tapped a few buttons, sending the screenshot off to their attorney, securing the evidence they needed in case things escalated further. Diane moved to the next task, her mind set on the final touches. Caleb had no idea what was coming. She had already updated the fraud alerts with the bank, removed him from beneficiary designations, and now it was time to finish this properly. With a deliberate calm, Diane updated her healthcare proxy and power of attorney, ensuring that Caleb would no longer have control over her medical or financial decisions. No more. The line was drawn, final, unmovable. The paperwork in front of her felt heavy now, a concrete marker of how much she had shifted her life. She had removed all traces of Caleb from her future. The son who had once been her responsibility was now someone who would have to fend for himself. Diane could no longer allow herself to be pulled back in. Her hand moved across the form, signing with quiet finality. The last step. It was done. Just as she set the pen down, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Mason. "Grandma, I made a drawing for you. It's us. You with scissors cutting the money hose." Diane's heart skipped. The image Mason had created felt like a window into his soul, a simple, innocent drawing, yet it spoke volumes. Diane's breath caught as she read it, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. He understood. For all the chaos, for all the hurt that had been inflicted on her, there was still something pure in the world. Someone who understood. Someone who had witnessed the unraveling and had seen her strength, even when she couldn't see it herself. Diane grabbed her phone and quickly replied, "Thank you, Mason. I'm proud of you. Always." The drawing, in its simplicity, felt like a balm to her soul. It was the small things, the moments of clarity, the signs that she had done the right thing. And as the snow continued to fall softly outside, Diane felt that, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. There was peace in the stillness, and it was hers. It was over. Diane's fingers were steady as she closed her laptop, the soft click of the lid reverberating in the quiet of the house. It felt final, somehow. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and there was no more paperwork to shuffle, no more decisions to make. The noise of the world outside, both the literal snowstorm and the emotional storm Caleb had left in his wake, felt distant now. She moved toward the window, staring out into the gray, a place where time seemed to stretch, where the world was in a hushed pause, much like the way she felt inside. The quiet had wrapped around her like a blanket, calming, steady. But then, the unmistakable sound of a car engine rumbled in the driveway. Diane didn't move at first, unsure whether it was her mind playing tricks on her. but the engine grew louder, a pulse in the stillness. It was Caleb. She knew it without even seeing him. His arrival, like his past visits, would be one of confrontation. Diane's heart skipped, but her breath didn't quicken. She had already made up her mind. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, but she didn't jump up. Instead, she moved slowly, methodically, to the hallway where the front door stood. Standing in front of it, her hand hovering over the handle, she paused. Through the peephole, she saw Caleb pacing on the front steps, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his posture stiff with anger. He had come for what he thought he was entitled to, the payment he assumed he could still collect. He hadn't learned. He still didn't see it. Her thumb lingered over the lock for just a moment longer before she made her decision. She wasn't going to open the door. Not for him. Not anymore. She stood there in the silence, watching as Caleb continued to fume, muttering to himself. His face was twisted with frustration. Each step he took an outward display of the fury he was trying to contain. Diane could hear his muffled shouts through the door, his voice rising in a mixture of indignation and desperation. "Mom, you can't just cut me off. This is family. You have an obligation to me." His words were hollow to her now, just noise. She had heard them too many times before. Without a word, Diane stepped away from the door, turning on her heel. She didn't need to answer him, not anymore. Behind her, Glenn appeared from the kitchen, his gaze flickering to the front door as Caleb continued to shout on the other side. Glenn had been quiet for the past few hours, but now he moved toward her with purpose. There was something resolute in his step, as though he understood everything that was happening without needing an explanation. "She doesn't owe you a damn dime," Glenn said to the door, his voice carrying through the house. There was no hesitation in his words, no uncertainty. It was a simple, powerful truth. Diane glanced at him, her eyes soft but firm. Glenn had been her steady presence throughout this entire process, someone who hadn't wavered when things got difficult, when the weight of her decisions threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't have to say anything. Glenn already knew what had to be done. They both heard Caleb's muffled curse from the other side of the door, followed by the sharp sound of his boots crunching in the snow as he stormed off the porch. His anger hung in the air like a cloud, but it didn't linger in the house. He was gone. The confrontation was over, and for the first time in a long time, Diane felt no relief in his departure, only the sense that it had to be this way. "That's it," Diane said quietly, turning toward the table where the legal documents still lay. Glenn stepped over to the door, locking it, sealing off any further intrusion from the son who had never understood what it meant to truly be a family. Abigail's name flashed in Diane's mind. She knew that Abigail would update the file on the incident, add another layer of documentation to the chain that was now binding Caleb in his own choices. No matter how much he tried to claim what wasn't his, it was over. The weight of everything that had been taken from Diane was now balanced by the strength she had found in herself. She walked to the table, picking up the last of the paperwork that had sealed Caleb's fate. There was no turning back. Not for him, not for her. "I'll finalize the last account removals," Glenn said, a quiet note of finality in his tone. Diane nodded, but didn't answer. There was no need for words now. Instead, Diane moved to the back of the house, finding herself in the kitchen. She turned on the kettle, the hum of it filling the space between her thoughts. The moments of peace she had craved were here, finally, but they came with a price. The phone buzzed again, but this time Diane didn't check it. The world could turn, and Caleb could scream all he wanted. She had already made her choice. The snow outside still fell, quiet and endless, and Diane, standing in the warmth of her kitchen, felt herself settle into the silence. It was done. It was over. But even as the calm settled in, there was a part of her that knew. This was just the beginning. The phone call came before she expected it. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Diane knew what it was the moment it rang. The bank. Caleb had made his move. He was trying to access funds he no longer had the right to. Diane's stomach tightened, but she didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone, the coldness of the call center voice offering no comfort. "Hello, Ms. Mercer. We've noticed suspicious activity on your account. A request has been made to withdraw funds, but it doesn't match the usual transactions." "Stop it," Diane said quietly, her voice flat. She had expected this. Caleb had always been impulsive when things didn't go his way. His sense of entitlement had no limits. "I need you to freeze all accounts immediately," Diane said, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Lock everything. No transfers, no withdrawals. Do it now." The bank representative was efficient, even calm in the face of Diane's urgency. Within minutes, all accounts were temporarily locked. She felt the immediate weight lift slightly off her shoulders. Caleb had made a crucial mistake. He hadn't learned. He thought he could still manipulate his way back in, but now he had sealed his own fate. Diane set the phone down and stood still for a moment, letting the relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet, but this was the final step in ensuring he couldn't come back. Not this time. As if on cue, the door to the kitchen opened and Glenn stepped inside, carrying the stack of documents she had worked on earlier. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. He had helped her with every piece of this plan, his calmness a constant grounding force. Diane knew that whatever happened next, she wouldn't be alone. "Bank accounts locked," Diane said, her voice steady, though there was a weight in the air. "He tried to make a withdrawal. It's done." Glenn nodded, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the table where the rest of the documents were scattered. He didn't flinch when he saw the note on the final sheet, "Fraud Prevention Action Taken," and simply began organizing the next steps. "Abigail's been working on the harassment documentation," Glenn said quietly as he flipped through the papers. "She'll file it in the morning. Once it's in the system, Caleb won't have any recourse." Diane didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the back room where her safe stood against the wall, waiting for her. The cool metal felt solid beneath her hand as she opened it, the familiar weight of old papers and family heirlooms adding a sense of finality to the moment. She took the files from the shelf, Caleb's account details, the transaction logs, the legal papers she'd signed over the last few days, and began to reorganize them. It was an act of control, of preparation, and of making sure everything was in place for what came next. She was methodical, no rush in her movements. Everything was locked down. Everything was sealed. The soft buzz of her phone broke the silence again. Diane didn't need to look at it to know who it was. She could guess from the timing. The words she read when she opened the message confirmed it. "Dad's losing it." Mason's message was brief, but it held a weight that made Diane pause. He had seen it. Caleb's reaction, the unfiltered rage. Diane could only imagine how the boy must have felt, standing by as his father lost control again. Her chest tightened for him. Mason didn't deserve this, not in the slightest. But she knew that, for all Caleb's anger, the boy would be safe. Diane had made sure of that. She took a moment before responding. The words came easily, comforting and firm, a reassurance she could give him now. A simple message in a time of uncertainty. "He's just trying to scare you, Mason. Don't let him. You're safe now. Always." As Diane hit send, she felt the weight of the words settle over her. Caleb had crossed a line, and now, no matter what he did, the game had ended. The phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't flinch. Her fingers remained steady as she set the phone aside and focused on the paperwork once more. She had done everything. The accounts, the legal filings, the letters to Mason. It was all in place. Everything was in its rightful place, and Caleb no longer had access. He could scream all he wanted, but he had no power left. The final boundary had been set. The final wall had been built. Diane exhaled slowly, her heart steady. There was no more uncertainty, no more second-guessing. Caleb would never control her again. And then, the thought occurred to her. This was just the beginning. She looked up at Glenn, who had been quiet for a few moments. He was watching her, but there was no sadness in his gaze, only quiet understanding. Diane had drawn the line. Caleb had made his choice, and now, it was his to deal with. She turned toward the window again, gazing out at the snow-covered world beyond. The stillness was peaceful. This was the calm she had fought for, the peace she had earned. But in the distance, Caleb's fury would rise again, and Diane knew she would be ready. The quiet of the house was almost tangible as Diane sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents in front of her. Everything was in place, every piece of the puzzle locked tight. Caleb and Brittany had tried to manipulate, try to control, but now the lines had been drawn. Diane knew there was nothing left for them to take, but as the soft hum of the house filled the air, another sound broke the stillness, the insistent ring of the doorbell. At first, Diane didn't move. She couldn't help but wonder if it was Caleb, returning in a last-ditch attempt to force his way into her life again. But the doorbell rang again, this time with more urgency, and Diane knew it wasn't Caleb. It was Brittany. A small flicker of annoyance passed through her, but Diane didn't rise from the table. Her resolve was firm, her actions clear. This was no longer about meeting their demands. It was about putting an end to it. She had already drawn the boundary. No one would cross it now. The knock on the door came a moment later, louder this time. Diane glanced at Glenn, who was still standing near the door, eyes flicking toward the sound. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet understanding between them. Glenn knew this moment was coming too. Diane stood, but not out of fear or obligation. She simply walked to the front door, every step deliberate. Reaching the door, she stood in front of the peephole, her hand resting on the doorknob. On the other side, Brittany was pacing, her posture rigid, her arms crossed tightly in front of her. "I know you're in there, Diane," Brittany called through the door, her voice sharp with frustration. "You need to reopen the accounts. You don't have the right to do this." Diane felt the heat of Brittany's anger seep through the door. It was a familiar tactic. Pressure, manipulation, guilt. She'd seen it all before. Brittany was trying to force her hand again, thinking that if she pushed hard enough, Diane would cave. Diane didn't move, just stood there, watching through the peephole. She could almost hear the words she'd expect next, the threats, the accusations. But she wasn't interested in playing that game anymore. The decisions had already been made. Brittany could shout all she wanted, but the door wasn't going to open. Brittany pounded on the door again. "You can't just cut him off, Diane. You'll ruin the family. This isn't over. You don't get to decide who's part of this family. You can't just abandon us." Diane's breath was calm as she turned to Glenn. "I'm not opening it," she said quietly. Glenn simply nodded, stepping forward toward the door. He had been waiting for this moment too. Diane had made her decision. Now it was time for Brittany to face the consequences of pushing too far. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a quick swipe, he activated the recording function. Brittany's voice carried through the door again, even more agitated now, as she threatened the consequences of Diane's actions. "You'll regret this, Diane. There will be consequences. Family will never forgive you for this. You'll see what happens when you walk away from us. You'll have no one left." Diane stayed calm, resolute. Glenn's phone screen flashed in the corner of her vision as he recorded the entire scene. There would be no more games, no more empty threats. Brittany could cry wolf all she wanted, but the truth would stand in black and white. After a few moments, Diane turned back toward the kitchen, her steps sure. Glenn, having done what he needed to do, followed her. But just as they reached the table, they heard the sharp click of the door handle. Brittany had tried to force it open. Diane didn't flinch. Just let the sound hang in the air. There was no place left for Brittany to go. The next sound was one Diane knew well, the click of heels against the front porch. Brittany was leaving, storming off in defeat. She had pushed, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. Diane let out a slow breath, feeling the tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding slip away. The doorbell rang once more, but this time it was silent. No angry voice behind it. Diane didn't answer it. She didn't need to. It was done. Glenn glanced at her, his face unreadable, but his gaze held that steady, quiet understanding. "It's over," he said. A simple statement, but it carried weight. Diane didn't reply right away. Instead, she walked to the counter, grabbed her phone, and hit the dial button for Abigail. The line clicked open, and Abigail's sharp voice greeted her almost immediately. "Let's finalize everything," Diane said, her voice firm and calm. "It's done. Lock it all up. The door's closed. Caleb, Brittany, they won't get anything else from me." Abigail's quick response came back with a reassuring finality. "I'll take care of the rest. We'll file the necessary documentation and have everything finalized. They can't touch you now, Diane." As Diane hung up, she felt something that had eluded her for so long: peace. She was free. And Caleb and Brittany would have to live with the consequences of their own choices now. She turned toward the window again, watching the snow fall quietly, blanketing everything in sight. The storm had passed. The world outside was still, calm, just like her heart had become. And for the first time in years, Diane felt that she was finally free. The envelope arrived just after noon, a simple white envelope with no return address, but Diane recognized it immediately. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she reached for it. She knew what it contained: the final confirmation that everything she'd set in motion had been completed. The silence of the house surrounded her as she sliced it open with a letter opener, the thin metal cutting through the paper with a clean, deliberate motion. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were typed neatly, precisely, with the formality of an official document. It was from Abigail, confirming that Diane's protective filings had been completed. All accounts were now legally sealed. Caleb had no recourse. Every transaction, every account, and every attempt to manipulate had been locked down with the full force of the law behind it. Diane sat back in her chair and let the weight of it sink in. There would be no more attempts, no more threats, no more manipulation. The finality of it filled her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe fully. Caleb's claims were over. Brittany's drama had come to an end. Glenn walked in as she was reading the document, his steps steady and quiet. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew what it meant. He'd been there through every step of this process, watching as Diane shed the weight of years of self-doubt, of holding on to a relationship that had become nothing more than a chain around her neck. Now, that chain had been broken. Abigail's voice echoed in Diane's mind as she thought of the final details. Abigail had called just before the envelope arrived, letting Diane know she had secured the trust documents in her office vault. They were locked away, safe from Caleb's reach, from Brittany's grasping hands. The trust, set up for Mason, was now untouchable, protected not only by legal frameworks, but by the love Diane had always tried to give, even when it was misused. The weight in Diane's chest shifted, lightened, as she set the document aside. This was the point of no return. Nothing Caleb could do now would affect her. She'd taken every precaution. She'd sealed every hole in the wall. He wouldn't break through. "Done," Glenn said quietly as he sat down beside her, looking over the documents one last time. There was a quiet satisfaction in his voice, but also something more, something unspoken. Diane couldn't help but appreciate the silence between them. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. They had both walked through the storm, and now it was over. Diane reached for her phone, her hands moving deliberately as she scrolled through the messages. The text from Mason caught her eye. She hadn't read it when it came in earlier, too busy with everything else, but now her heart softened as she pressed open the message. "Grandma, I'm proud of you." Diane smiled, a soft, genuine smile that came from the deepest part of her. She hadn't expected anything from Mason, but the words were everything. She didn't need anything else. Her decision had been worth it. The message felt like a balm to the ache that had settled in her chest over the years. Caleb's disappointment, Brittany's manipulation, none of it mattered anymore. Mason understood. He had seen what had happened, had witnessed the fallout, but in his eyes, it wasn't about guilt or anger. It was just pride. Diane hit reply and typed back quickly. "I'm proud of you too, Mason. Always." She set the phone down, and for a moment, the stillness was complete. The world outside was blanketed in snow, the first layer of winter's quiet covering everything. The ice began to form on the window panes as the temperature dropped, but inside, Diane felt nothing but peace. The storm had passed, and now, the world outside could be as cold as it wanted to be. Diane had built a warm space inside her walls, a space no one could invade. The phone buzzed again, but this time, Diane didn't even look at it. She didn't need to. She didn't need to know what Caleb was doing anymore. The decision had been made. The final step had been taken. She turned to Glenn, who had picked up the latest file, his expression calm but knowing. It had taken everything to get here. Everything she'd had to give, and all that she had endured. But it was worth it. Diane had drawn the line. "I think we're done here," Diane said softly, her voice sure, with a new weight in it. Glenn smiled, a subtle but knowing curve of his lips. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice steady. "You did good." And just like that, Diane finally felt free. The quiet of the house matched the peace in her heart. It was over. But she knew the cold would come, the frost would settle in, and soon, the ice would blanket everything. Yet for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an ending. An end to the chaos. Diane took a deep breath and listened to the world outside. The snow fell softly, a peaceful, unbroken quiet. It was done. And this time, it was for good. The morning of the hearing was cold, the kind of biting chill that seeped in through the cracks of old windows. Diane sat in the lawyer's office, a sterile room where the cold didn't just come from the temperature. It was the kind of cold that made people afraid of the truth. The paperwork in front of her was neatly organized, stacked just so, each document telling the story of everything she had done, everything she had built and fought for. She hadn't expected things to escalate to this point. The legal threats, the constant pressure. Diane had hoped that once she made her decision, once the accounts were locked and the final decisions were made, it would be over. But Caleb had not let go easily. His desperation, his inability to understand that there was no more money to take, had forced this final confrontation. The APS investigator sat across from her now, a professional-looking man with an air of detached authority. He had come to assess whether Diane was still competent to manage her own affairs, to check whether Caleb's accusations of financial abandonment were valid. Diane didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for this moment. The truth, the unvarnished reality of the situation, was clear and unassailable. The investigator slid a folder across the table, the contents neatly arranged. Her finances, transaction logs, timelines of payments made to Caleb over the years. He didn't speak immediately, but began to sift through the papers with a quick, practiced motion. The silence in the room felt heavy, but Diane wasn't concerned. She had nothing to hide. "I see," he said after a moment, his voice measured. He didn't look up at her. He simply flipped through page after page, noting the transfers, the gifts, the years of financial support. He paused on the document detailing Caleb's repeated demands for money, the requests for emergency transfers, the mortgages paid off, the car insurance, the grocery bills. Everything was documented. Everything had been recorded. When he finally did meet her gaze, it wasn't with suspicion. It was with a kind of detached professionalism. "You've provided financial assistance to your son for many years, but I don't see any indication that these were loans, or that you were under any obligation to make these payments." Diane nodded. There had been no contracts, no promises. Every payment had been voluntary, every act of kindness freely given. Caleb had twisted it into something else, something he believed he was entitled to. But Diane knew better now. She had seen the truth through the fog of guilt and obligation, and she wasn't going to let it cloud her anymore. "I've made every transfer voluntarily," Diane said, her voice calm but firm. "There was no obligation. I never expected anything in return. But the decision to stop? It's mine. I've given enough." The investigator scribbled some notes, his pen moving quickly across the page. "I'm reviewing the logs now. Your decision to stop these payments appears to be within your rights. There are no signs of financial misconduct or any indication that you were not competent in managing your finances." Diane watched him work, the quiet assurance growing in her chest. This wasn't about her being right. It was about her taking control, about ensuring that she never let Caleb's manipulation determine the course of her life again. The investigator leaned back in his chair, glancing up at her with a look that almost bordered on curiosity. "It seems to me, Ms. Mercer, that you've been fully competent throughout this process. Your decisions are your own, and there's no evidence of coercion or incapacity on your part." Diane sat still, letting the words sink in. Caleb's claims, his accusations of financial abandonment, were nothing but smoke and mirrors. The investigator was confirming what she had known all along. She was fully capable of making her own decisions. "It's clear you've thought this through," the investigator continued, flipping the final pages of the folder. He stopped and made a note, then closed the file. "Your son's claims have no legal merit. This situation appears to be resolved." Diane allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Caleb had tried to drag her into this battle, tried to use the legal system to force her hand, but he had failed. His manipulation had crumbled under the weight of truth and legality. The investigator rose and extended his hand. "I'll file my report. There's no reason to pursue this further. You're free to continue managing your affairs." Diane stood, her hand steady as she shook his. "Thank you." As the investigator left the room, Diane felt the finality of it settle over her like a soft blanket. Caleb had no more power. Brittany had no more leverage. There would be no more threats, no more guilt trips. She had drawn the line, and now it was firmly in place. She sat back down at the table, the papers now feeling lighter than before. But as she scanned over the documents again, something caught her eye. The final codicil that Abigail had drafted. Caleb's name had been permanently removed. His access to her estate, his ability to manipulate her financially, gone, sealed, final. Diane picked up the pen, her fingers steady as she signed it. There was no hesitation now. This was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. A chapter where she was free. Free from Caleb. Free from guilt. Free from all the years she had spent trying to save him when he had never wanted to be saved. As the ink dried on the paper, she knew that nothing, not Caleb, not Brittany, not anyone, would ever make her doubt her decision again. And just before she stood to leave, her phone buzzed. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was. The message was from Mason, and this time, Diane didn't hesitate. "Grandma, I'm so proud of you." Diane smiled softly, her heart full. The world outside had gotten quieter, colder. But inside, Diane was warmer than she'd ever been. It was finally over. Diane stepped into the small, cozy shop downtown, a hand-knitted scarf draped over her shoulder. The scent of wool and coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft chatter of women sitting around tables, their knitting needles clicking in sync. The door closed behind her with a soft chime, and for a moment, the weight of the world outside seemed to fall away. It had been weeks since everything had settled, since Caleb's claims had crumbled, since the legal documents were final. The world outside still spun, but Diane felt as though she had finally stepped off that endless carousel, her footing solid. She had drawn the line, and now she was free to start living for herself. The knitting club was warm, a peaceful contrast to the cold, barren landscape outside. She glanced around the room, smiling at the women who greeted her with friendly nods. It wasn't much, a weekly gathering of a few quiet women who'd been coming together for years. But for Diane, it felt like an entirely new world, one that didn't revolve around obligations to people who didn't care enough to see her for who she truly was. She took a seat at a table near the window, and as she settled in, one of the women, a soft-spoken woman with gray hair and glasses, offered her a basket of yarn. "Pick out your color, dear. We've got a lot of projects in the works." Diane smiled. It was simple, quiet, but there was something deeply fulfilling about the idea of creating something for herself, for no one else. She picked out a soft blue yarn and began to work, her fingers moving in familiar rhythm. The motions felt calming, meditative, as though each stitch was a small act of reclaiming the parts of herself she had given away for so long. For the first time in a long time, Diane allowed herself to simply be. No expectations, no guilt, no one needing something from her. Just the rhythm of the needles, the company of women who, like her, were learning how to make something beautiful out of simple things. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted back to her life binder. It had always been there, a well-organized collection of every decision, every plan, every transaction. But now it wasn't just a collection of documents. It was a symbol of her independence, a testament to the life she was finally reclaiming for herself. She had made sure that Mason's future was secure, that Caleb's ability to manipulate her was gone for good. But now it was time for Diane to focus on herself. When she got home later that day, she sat down with the binder and began updating it. Not with legal matters or transactions, but with something entirely different. Letters to Mason. Simple letters, written for when he was older. Letters that spoke of love, of lessons learned, of the strength it had taken to let go. She knew one day when he was older, he would understand why she had made the choices she did. But for now, it was a letter for him, a promise that his future was secure and that he would never have to carry the weight she had carried for so long. As she finished the last one, she closed the binder and set it aside. It felt complete in a way it never had before. She wasn't just protecting him, she was protecting herself too. The next day, Diane walked into a local shop she hadn't noticed before, the kind of place with old wooden counters and polished brass accents. She wandered the aisles, letting her eyes fall on the many trinkets, but her attention was drawn to one thing in particular: a metal money clip. It was small, sturdy, practical, and the moment Diane touched it, she knew it was hers. She brought it to the counter, the cool metal warm in her hand as she handed over the payment. It was a simple thing, but for Diane, it felt like an important one. It wasn't about the money or the material, it was about taking something for herself. She had always been the one to give, to open her hands, to make sure others were okay. But now, she was holding on to something that was hers. When she arrived home, Glenn was there waiting, as he always had been. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, his expression as calm as ever. Diane noticed him glance at the money clip, the corner of his mouth curling into a small, approving smile. "You're glowing," he said quietly, a softness in his voice that made Diane pause. She hadn't realized it, but as she looked at him, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift completely. It wasn't about the decisions she'd made anymore, or the battles she'd fought. It was about where she was now. She had taken back her life. It was a small, but powerful truth. "I feel like I'm finally breathing," Diane said, her voice steady but filled with something she hadn't felt in so long. "Peace." Glenn's smile widened, and he gave her a simple nod. There was nothing more to say. They both knew that this chapter of her life had ended, and a new one had begun. Later that evening, Diane took the metal money clip and placed it in her nightstand drawer. It wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol. A symbol of strength, of independence, and of the life she was finally living for herself. As the day faded into night and the quiet settled in, Diane felt that calm again. The kind of calm that came from knowing she was in control. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And for the first time in years, it felt good to simply be. The storm had passed. The world outside was quiet. And inside, Diane knew she had found her peace. The event was simple enough. A community gathering for Mason, a school performance that showcased his accomplishments, a quiet celebration of the young man he was becoming. Diane sat in the back, Abigail beside her, her presence a solid anchor in the whirlwind of the past few months. Diane could feel the quiet hum of anticipation in the room as families filled the seats, all smiles and chatter. But Diane wasn't here for the noise. She was here for Mason. For him to know that despite everything, he was loved, protected, and secure. She scanned the room, her gaze moving over the sea of proud faces. But it was Caleb and Brittany who stood out. They were across the room, whispering in the corner, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Diane. The tension between them was palpable. But for once, Diane wasn't consumed by it. She had done what she needed to do. The trust was irrevocably in place. Caleb had no power over her anymore, and that truth settled in her chest like a weight lifted. As the event continued, Diane kept her eyes on Mason, her pride swelling with each performance. But she knew the real moment was coming, the moment when the final piece would fall into place. The school assembly concluded, and the families gathered in the lobby for a brief reception. Diane moved toward the table where the trust packet was waiting, already signed and sealed, ready to be publicly confirmed. Abigail had arranged for everything to be signed and finalized during this event, with a witness from the school, ensuring it had the full weight of legality. This would be the moment. Mason's future, irrevocably secure, would be tied to her name. Caleb wouldn't be able to touch it. As Diane approached the table, she could feel Caleb's eyes on her, sharp and filled with something else. Desperation. He wasn't foolish enough to believe it was over. He had to know the final blow was coming. Brittany, standing beside him, wore a thin smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The facade was cracking. Caleb was losing his grip on the world he had taken for granted for so long. Abigail stood beside Diane, her posture professional, every motion precise. Without a word, she slid the final packet of papers toward Diane, the trust documents already fully drafted. Caleb and Brittany hadn't yet realized what they were about to see, but their expressions shifted the moment Diane signed the final page. The sound of the pen meeting paper felt louder than it was. A final act of finality, sealing the last of the ties between her and Caleb. Diane had taken back her power in a way that made her untouchable. As she lifted the pen and handed it back to Abigail, She glanced at Caleb. His jaw was clenched, the realization sinking in that there was nothing he could do to reverse it. The look in his eyes was a mix of anger, frustration, and something else. Regret. Regret for pushing her too far, for treating her as if she were nothing more than an ATM, someone to use up and discard. His mouth opened, but no words came out, not right away. Then he stepped forward, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to grasp at the last thread of control. "This is ridiculous," he spat, but Diane wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't interested in the anger he used as a weapon, nor in the manipulation that had so often controlled her. This time, the only thing she heard was the sound of her own heart steadying as she let go of him for good. She turned her attention to Mason, who had walked up just in time to witness the final moment. His eyes widened as he looked between her and Caleb, his expression softening as he slowly understood what had just happened. Diane stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug, her arms wrapping around him with all the love she could give. "Mason," she whispered, "you're safe. Always. This is for you." Mason hugged her back tightly, his small frame pressing against hers as though trying to convey all the gratitude and relief he had been carrying for so long. Diane could feel the weight lifting from him, and from her. The final confirmation that everything she had done had been worth it. He was protected, his future secure, and Caleb would no longer have any hold over him, over any of them. From across the room, Caleb watched, his eyes dark and full of resentment. His loss was undeniable. The woman who had once been his emotional crutch was now standing taller than ever. And for the first time, he realized that she was beyond his reach. Diane smiled at Mason and gave him one last squeeze before pulling away, looking down at him with pride. The moment Caleb realized he had lost it all was clear. The frustration, the anger. It was all there in his stiff posture, his clenched fists, the way he tried to hide the rage swirling just beneath the surface. But it was too late. Diane had already taken back everything she'd ever given him. "I think it's time to go," Diane said softly to Glenn. He stood beside her, his smile calm, supportive. Together, they turned and walked toward the door, Diane with a quiet strength that felt like the softest victory. As she reached the door, she turned for one last glance at Caleb, whose face was a twisted mask of disbelief. He didn't move toward her. He didn't chase. He knew it was over. Diane stepped out into the cold evening air with Glenn at her side. As they walked away, she thought of the words Caleb had thrown at her, the words that had finally led her to this moment. "You're just a monthly expense." And she smiled, a soft, knowing smile. So I ended every payment that night,